You already know something is off. You just don't want to say it out loud, because once you admit it, you can't hide from it anymore. People don't take you seriously. Not fully, not deeply, not in the way you expected when you imagined who you could become. And it doesn't happen in obvious ways. No one walks up and disrespects you to your face. No one declares it, no one announces it, but you feel it in the pauses, in the way they interrupt you mid-sentence, like your words are optional, in the way they respond to others with focus, but to you with half attention, in the way your presence doesn't shift the room, it just blends into it. And the most dangerous part is that you've started to normalize it. You've started telling yourself stories to protect your ego. They're just busy. It's not a big deal. I don't care anyway. But if you truly didn't care, you wouldn't feel that quiet tension in your chest every time it happens. You wouldn't replay conversations in your head later wondering what you should have said differently. You wouldn't feel that subtle frustration when someone with less intelligence, less depth, less awareness somehow commands more respect than you without trying. And that's the moment that bothers you the most. Not because you envy them, but because it forces you to confront a truth you've been avoiding. This is not about your capability, it's about your presence. And presence is not something you think into existence. It's something you signal, unconsciously, constantly, through micro behaviors you rarely question. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the problem is not that people are unfair. The problem is that people are consistent. They respond to signals, not intentions. They react to what you show, not what you mean. And what you're showing right now is not what you think you're showing. You believe you're being kind, but they read it as weak boundaries. You believe you're being flexible, but they read it as lack of standards. You believe you're being polite, but they read it as uncertainty, and the gap between your intention and their perception. That gap is where your respect disappears, slowly, quietly, without resistance. And you don't notice it collapsing in real time. You only notice the outcome, the accumulated effect, the pattern that keeps repeating no matter where you go. New environment, new people, same result. Because you carried the pattern with you, not consciously, but behaviorally. And behavior is what the world responds to. Not your internal narrative, not your hidden confidence, not your potential, only what is visible, only what is felt. And if what is felt is hesitation, if what is felt is over-explaining, if what is felt is a need to be liked, then the conclusion is already made before you finish your first sentence. And that's the part no one tells you. Respect is not built slowly over years, the way you were taught. It is decided in seconds, in fragments, in moments so small you overlook them. The way you enter a room, the way you hold eye contact, the way you react when someone cuts you off, the way you respond when challenged. These are not random details, they are data points, and people are constantly collecting them, building a psychological profile of you without realizing it, deciding where you stand in the invisible hierarchy that exists in every social interaction. And once that position is set, it becomes very difficult to change. Not impossible, but costly. Because now you have to break a pattern that has already been reinforced. And here's the twist that most people refuse to accept. The reason you are not being respected is not because you lack something external. It's because you are unconsciously giving something away, over and over again. Small pieces of authority, small concessions, small moments where you choose comfort over clarity, approval over truth, silence over presence. And each time you do that, you think it's insignificant. You think it's just one moment. But the brain doesn't work that way. The brain tracks patterns, and patterns create identity, not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. And once your internal identity shifts into someone who is often overlooked, your behavior aligns with it automatically. You speak a little softer, you hesitate a little longer, you question yourself a little more, and that subtle shift compounds until it becomes your default state. And now, you're not just experiencing disrespect, you're expecting it. And expectation changes everything. Because when you expect to be overlooked, you unconsciously behave in ways that make it easier for people to overlook you. And this is where most people get trapped. They try to fix the outcome instead of the signal. They try to be louder, more expressive, more impressive. But that's not the solution, because noise without authority is just noise. And people can feel the difference instantly. They can feel when someone is trying to compensate, trying to prove something, trying to earn validation. And the more you try, the more it exposes the underlying insecurity you're trying to hide. So the solution is not to add more, it's to remove what's leaking, remove the unnecessary explanations, remove the constant need to fill silence, remove the habit of softening your words to make others comfortable, remove the instinct to immediately respond to everything as if your time has no weight. Because right now, your biggest problem is not that you lack strength, it's that your strength is diluted by your own behavior. And until you see that clearly, nothing changes. Because you will keep operating under the illusion that the world is the problem, when in reality the world is just mirroring what you project. And that mirror is brutally honest. It doesn't care about your intentions. It reflects your signals, exactly as they are. And if you're willing to look at it without defending yourself, without justifying your habits, without hiding behind explanations, then you start to see the truth. Not a comfortable truth, not a motivational lie, but a precise, almost surgical clarity. You start to notice the moments where you gave up your position without resistance, the times you laughed something off when you should have held eye contact and said nothing, the times you agreed when you didn't want to just to avoid tension, the times you explained yourself in circles, hoping to be understood, instead of simply stating your position and letting it stand. And once you see these moments, you realize something critical. You were never powerless. You were just unguarded. You let your boundaries blur. You let your presence weaken. You let your value become negotiable. Not because you had to, but because you didn't realize the cost. And now you're starting to see it, not as a single mistake, but as a pattern that has been shaping your reality for longer than you admit. And here's the part that changes everything. Once you become aware of a pattern, you can no longer blame the outcome on external factors, because now you see the mechanism, you see the cause, and that means you also see the possibility of control, not over people, not over their thoughts, but over your signals, your behavior, your presence. And that is where real authority begins, not in dominating others, but in no longer abandoning yourself in small moments, because those small moments are not small. They are the foundation of how the world experiences you. And if you change them, consistently, deliberately, without seeking immediate validation, something shifts. Not instantly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. People hesitate before interrupting you. Conversations slow down when you speak. Your words carry more weight, not because you say more, but because you say less with precision, and the respect you were chasing starts to appear. Not as something you begged for, but as something you no longer leak away. And that is the difference between someone who is seen and someone who is overlooked. Let's remove the comfort layer and look at this without decoration, because what you're experiencing is not random, and it's not complicated, it's patterned. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. People are not deciding to disrespect you in a conscious, malicious way. They are reacting to signals you continuously emit. Signals that quietly tell them where you stand in relation to them. And the uncomfortable truth is that those signals are not aligned with the image you have of yourself. You think you're composed, but your micro-hesitations expose doubt. You think you're kind, but your inability to hold a boundary communicates weakness. You think you're easygoing, but your constant availability signals low value. And the brain on the other side doesn't analyze this with logic, it reads it instinctively. It categorizes you within seconds, not based on your potential, but based on your consistency. And consistency is built through repetition. So every time you repeat the same small concession, the same softened tone, the same over-explanation, you reinforce a position you don't actually want. And that's why it feels like no matter where you go, the result follows you. Because the pattern travels with you, not the environment, not the people, you. And until that pattern is interrupted, nothing changes. Now understand this clearly. Respect is not a reward system. It is a response system. People respond to clarity, to certainty, to boundaries that don't move under pressure. And if your behavior lacks those elements, the response you get will always be diluted. Now here's where most people make the mistake. They try to fix this by adding more, speaking more, proving more, explaining more. But that only amplifies the problem. Because the more you try to convince, the more you reveal that you are seeking validation. And validation seeking is one of the fastest ways to lower perceived authority. So instead of adding, you need to start subtracting. Subtract the unnecessary words. Subtract the reactive responses. Subtract the impulse to immediately justify yourself. Because power is not built through volume. It is built through control. Control over what you say, when you say it, and whether it needs to be said at all. And this brings you to the first shift, the reality slap that most people resist. You are not being overlooked because people are unfair. You are being overlooked because your behavior makes it easy to overlook you. And that's not an insult, it's a mechanism. A mechanism you can change if you stop protecting your current habits and start examining them. Now go deeper. Understand the psychology behind this. Human beings operate on shortcuts. They don't have the time or energy to fully analyze everyone they meet. So they rely on patterns, and those patterns are built from observable behavior. Confidence is not something they measure internally. They infer it from external cues. How quickly you respond, how much you explain, how you handle silence, how you react under pressure. And each of these cues either strengthens or weakens your perceived position. If you respond instantly to everything, you signal that your time is not in demand. If you explain every decision, you signal that you need approval. If you react emotionally, you signal that you can be influenced. And once those signals accumulate, the brain forms a stable perception, and that perception becomes your identity in their eyes. Not because it's accurate, but because it's consistent. And consistency is what the brain trusts. Now place yourself in a simple scenario. You're speaking and someone interrupts you. This is not a dramatic moment. It's subtle, almost insignificant, but it's one of the clearest signals you can observe. You have two options. You can stop and let them take over, or you can hold your ground and continue speaking without raising your voice. Most people choose the first option because it feels polite. It avoids tension. It maintains comfort. But what it actually does is it communicates that your voice is negotiable, that your position can be displaced without resistance. And once that happens once, it becomes easier for it to happen again. Not because people are targeting you, but because you've shown them there's no friction, no consequence, no resistance. Now reverse the scenario. You don't react emotionally. You don't raise your voice. You simply continue your sentence, calmly, steadily, without acknowledging the interruption. And suddenly, the dynamic shifts, not dramatically, but perceptibly, because you introduced resistance, and resistance forces recalibration. People adjust to resistance. They respect what doesn't move easily. And this is where you begin to understand that respect is less about what you demand and more about what you refuse to tolerate. Now apply the first rule with precision. Stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. Not in an aggressive way, not in a defensive way, but in a controlled, deliberate way. When you make a decision, state it once, clearly, without padding it with excessive reasoning, because every extra sentence you add weakens the impact of the first one. It gives the other person space to question, to negotiate, to reinterpret. And you might think you're being helpful by explaining, but what you're actually doing is inviting doubt. Powerful communication is not about covering every angle. It's about delivering a clear position and letting it stand. And the silence that follows is not something to fear, it's something to use, because silence creates weight. It forces the other person to process instead of react. And most people rush to fill silence because they're uncomfortable with it. But that discomfort is exactly what gives your words impact. Now move to the second rule. Control your reactions, because your reaction is the fastest way for people to measure your stability. If you react quickly, emotionally, predictably, you become easy to read. And what is easy to read is easy to influence. People don't need to understand you deeply. They just need to know how to trigger a response. And once they know that, your position weakens. Not because they are trying to control you, but because your behavior allows it. So the shift here is not to suppress emotion, but to delay reaction. Create a gap between stimulus and response, even if it's only a few seconds, because that gap is where control lives. In that gap, you decide whether the situation deserves a response, what kind of response it deserves, and how much energy it's worth. And when people notice that you don't react instantly, that you choose your responses carefully, they become more cautious, not necessarily more respectful immediately, but more aware, and awareness is the beginning of respect. Now the third rule, reduce your availability. And this is where most people struggle, because it goes against everything they've been conditioned to believe. They think being responsive, being accessible, being always there is a sign of value. But in reality, it removes scarcity. And without scarcity, there is no perceived importance. If someone can access you at any time, Your time loses weight, your attention loses value. And this doesn't mean you become distant or cold. It means you become selective. You respond when it makes sense, not when it's expected. You say yes when it aligns, not when it's convenient for others. And that selectivity creates a subtle shift in perception. People start to recognize that your time is not automatic, that your attention is not guaranteed, and that recognition changes how they approach you. Now connect these rules together, because individually they are useful, but collectively they form a pattern that replaces the old one. You stop over-explaining, so your words gain weight. You control your reactions, so your presence becomes stable. You reduce your availability, so your time becomes valuable. And these shifts are not loud. They are not dramatic. They don't require you to become someone else. They require you to stop doing what's been weakening you, consistently, quietly, without announcing it. And over time the pattern changes, not because you force people to respect you, but because you stopped giving them reasons not to. And this is the key point that needs to be reinforced. You were never lacking value. You were misrepresenting it through behavior. And behavior is adjustable, not instantly, not perfectly, but progressively. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to reinforce the new pattern. Every moment where you choose clarity over comfort, control over reaction, selectivity over availability, you strengthen your position. And the more consistent you are, the more stable that position becomes, until eventually it stops being something you think about and starts being something you embody. And when that happens, the dynamic shifts, not because the world changed, but because your signal did. And once your signal is clear, consistent, and controlled, the response becomes inevitable. Not guaranteed from everyone, but consistent enough that the difference becomes undeniable. And that's when you realize the truth you were avoiding at the beginning. Respect was never something you had to chase. It was something you had to stop leaking. Power is quiet, and that is why you've been missing it. Because you were taught to look for something louder, something visible, something that announces itself. But real power doesn't introduce itself. It reveals itself in restraint, in precision, in the ability to not react when reaction is expected. And right now, everything you've seen, everything you've felt in your own life, points to one simple conclusion that is difficult to accept, but impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. You have been negotiating your own position in ways so subtle you didn't even register them as decisions. You thought they were just habits, personality traits, ways of being nice or easygoing. But they were not neutral. They were signals. And those signals have been shaping how the world responds to you with surgical accuracy. Not emotionally, not personally, just mechanically. Because people respond to consistency, and your consistency has been telling a story that doesn't match who you believe you are. And that mismatch is where your frustration lives. That gap between your internal identity and your external behavior. And closing that gap is not about becoming more. It's about removing what distorts the signal, removing the unnecessary words, the automatic reactions, the constant availability, the invisible concessions that slowly erode your position. And when you remove them, something interesting happens. Not immediately, not dramatically, but undeniably, your presence starts to feel different, not just to others, but to you. Because for the first time, you are no longer abandoning your own position in small moments. You are holding it, quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. And that internal shift is the foundation of everything else. Because when you stop betraying your own standards, your behavior aligns with a different identity. An identity that doesn't need to prove itself, doesn't need to chase validation, doesn't need to explain every move. And that identity communicates itself without effort, through stillness, through clarity, through the absence of unnecessary noise. And people feel that before they understand it. They adjust to it before they can articulate why. And this is where the real shift begins. Not in forcing respect, but in becoming someone who doesn't leak it. Someone whose presence has weight because it is not diluted. And that weight changes interactions in ways that are subtle, but powerful. Conversations become more focused when you speak. Interruptions decrease, not because you demand it, but because your signal discourages it. Your words carry more impact, not because they are louder, but because they are fewer and more precise. And the respect that once felt distant starts to appear, not as a reward, but as a natural response to a stable signal. And this is where you need to be careful, because this is also where people become inconsistent. They apply these shifts temporarily. They see small changes, and then they revert. Because the old habits are comfortable, familiar, easy. But comfort is what created the problem in the first place. Comfort made you over-explain. Comfort made you avoid tension. Comfort made you stay available even when it cost you. So if you return to comfort without awareness, you return to the same pattern, and the same outcome follows. So the final rule is not about what you do once. It's about what you refuse to stop doing. It's about consistency at a level that doesn't depend on mood, doesn't depend on environment, doesn't depend on who you're dealing with. You maintain the same standards with everyone, not aggressively, not rigidly, but steadily. Because inconsistency is what breaks the signal. If you hold your ground sometimes but fold in other moments, the brain on the other side receives mixed data, and mixed data creates uncertainty, and uncertainty lowers perceived authority. So the goal is not perfection, it is alignment. Alignment between what you believe and how you behave. And that alignment needs to be visible, not through words, but through repeated actions. Repeated decisions where you choose clarity over comfort, control over reaction, selectivity over availability. And each time you make that choice, you reinforce the new pattern. You strengthen the new identity. You make it easier for the next moment to follow the same direction, until eventually it becomes automatic, not something you force, but something you are. And this is where the truth becomes unavoidable. Respect is not something you ask for. It is something you stop compromising. And once you stop compromising it, the world adjusts, not because it owes you anything, but because it has no other signal to follow. And some people will not adjust, some will resist, some will test you more when they feel the change. And that is not a sign that it's not working. It's a confirmation that your signal is different. Because when you change your position, the system recalibrates. And recalibration often comes with resistance. But if you hold steady, if you don't revert, if you don't explain, if you don't react, that resistance fades. And what remains is a new baseline, a new way people interact with you that feels unfamiliar at first, but quickly becomes the standard. And that is when you understand something most people never reach. You were never at the mercy of how people treated you. You were at the mercy of the signals you were sending. And once you take control of those signals, you take control of the outcome. Not perfectly, not universally, but enough to change the trajectory of your interactions, your opportunities, your presence in any room you enter. And that is power, not the loud, aggressive version that demands attention, but the quiet, controlled version that commands it without asking. And now the only question that matters is not whether this works, because you already see that it does. The question is whether you are willing to sustain it, whether you are willing to let go of the habits that have been costing you, whether you are willing to sit in the discomfort of silence, of delayed reaction, of selective availability, long enough for the new pattern to take hold. Because if you are, the shift is inevitable. And if you're not, nothing changes, and you return to the same cycle, the same frustration, the same quiet awareness that something is off. So decide, not emotionally, not impulsively, but deliberately. Decide where your position is, and then stop negotiating it, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Because consistency is what turns behavior into identity, and identity is what the world responds to. And once that identity is clear, stable, and aligned, the respect you were searching for stops being something you chase and becomes something that follows you, quietly, naturally, without effort, because you are no longer giving it away.